For this movement analysis, I analyzed the functional task of opening a jar of peanut butter, which is part of meal preparation and is an instrumental activity of daily living. For the purposes of this project, the jar was loosened so that all of the phases of the movement could be seen and there wasn't repeated turning of the lid of the jar. So far, you have seen the whole movement from different angles, so let's explore what is happening in each phase. In the preparatory phase, Kara is thinking about the movement that she has to complete and preparing her body for the task. Kara starts at rest and begins to generate force in her muscles to be able to complete the task. The preparatory phase ends as soon as she touches the lid of the jar. When she touches the lid of the jar, the movement phase begins. In this phase, the goal of the task is completed. For this task, the goal would be to open the jar of peanut butter by removing the lid. As soon as the lid is removed, the movement phase has ended. When the lid is being taken away from the jar, the follow-through phase has started. This phase is about decelerating the movement and preparing to recover from the motion. This phase ends when the lid is placed on the counter. As soon as Kara removes her hand from the lid, the recovery phase begins. This phase is about finishing at a resting position to stop the movement, regaining balance, and preparing to complete other movements. This phase ends when Kara's hands are at her side and she is ready to complete another movement. Next, we'll look at the specific movements happening in each phase. In the preparatory phase, the right shoulder moves into about 75 degrees of flexion, 45 degrees of abduction, 30 degrees of internal rotation, and 50 degrees of horizontal adduction from the neutral position. The elbow moves into about 45 degrees of flexion from neutral, and the forearm moves from a neutral position into 80 degrees of pronation, which is full range. The wrist flexes about 55 degrees from neutral and moves into 30 degrees of ulnar deviation, which is full range, to prepare to turn the lid. Down the hand, the thumb moves from about 15 degrees of palmar abduction in the beginning to about 35 degrees at the end of the phase. The thumb MP and IP joints, as well as the other digits, MCP, PIP, and DIP joints, are in flexion for most of the phase, except for right before Kara grabs the jar. Then the digital PIPs and DIPs go into slight extension to clear the sides of the lid. On the left side, the shoulder moves into about 45 degrees of flexion. Down the arm, the elbow moves into about 80 degrees of flexion and the forearm remains neutral. The wrist moves into about 20 degrees of extension to grab the jar. The thumb is in about 45 degrees of palmar abduction, which is full range, and the rest of the joints of the thumb are fully extended. The MCP joints of the other digits are neutral, and they slightly hyperextend to grasp the jar. The PIP and DIP joints of the digits are flexed for the majority of the movement, but also go into extension right before grabbing the jar. In the movement phase, the right shoulder moves from 75 to 80 degrees of flexion and 45 to 50 degrees of abduction. Internal rotation and horizontal adduction stay the same. The elbow stays at 45 degrees of flexion and the forearm is still fully pronated at 80 degrees. The wrist is in about 15 degrees of extension during the ulnar deviation when the turning motion begins, but then moves into about 20 degrees of radial deviation where it goes to 55 degrees of flexion and goes to about 65 degrees of flexion while turning the lid of the jar. The thumb and other digits stay in their ending positions from the preparatory phase, which means that all of the joints are in flexion except for the thumb CMC joint, which is in palmar abduction. The left side stays the same as the end positions of the preparatory phase during the movement phase to stabilize the jar during the turning movement. In the follow-through phase, the right shoulder moves from 80 to 90 degrees of flexion when lifting the lid away from the jar, and then moves from 90 to 10 degrees of flexion when moving to put the lid on the counter. Shoulder abduction stays the same at 45 degrees. Internal rotation moves from 30 to 10 degrees, and horizontal adduction moves from 50 to 10 degrees. The elbow moves from 45 degrees of flexion to 55 when lifting the jar and then goes back down to 45 when moving the lid back to the counter. The forearm is still fully pronated at 80 degrees during this phase. The wrist is still in 65 degrees of flexion and moves from 20 to 0 degrees of radial deviation by the end of the phase. The fingers remain in the same positions that they were in during the movement phase, which means that all joints are flexed except for the thumb CMC joint, which is in palmar abduction. The left side remains the same as the last phase throughout the follow-through phase to continue to stabilize the jar. In the recovery phase, the right shoulder moves from 10 to 0 degrees of flexion and from 45 to 0 degrees of abduction. The shoulder also moves into 0 degrees of internal rotation and horizontal adduction. The elbow moves into 90 degrees of flexion when her arm is at her side, and then into extension from 90 to 0 degrees to finish the recovery phase. The forearm moves from 80 degrees of pronation to the neutral position, which is 0 degrees. The wrist moves from 65 degrees to about 10 degrees of flexion by the end of the phase. The thumb CMC joint moves from 35 degrees of palmar abduction to about 15 degrees, and the rest of the thumb joint extends to 0 degrees. The other finger joints extend slightly to release the jar, and then move into more degrees of flexion when the movement ends. On the left side, the shoulder moves from 45 to 0 degrees of flexion, and the elbow moves from 80 to 0 degrees of extension. The wrist moves from 20 to 0 degrees of extension, and the forearm stays neutral during this phase. The thumb CMC joint moves from 45 to 15 degrees of palmar abduction, and the rest of the thumb joints extend from their positions to 0 degrees. The MCP, PIP, and DIP joints of the digits all start in their flexed positions, but then move to 0 degrees of extension when first releasing the jar. Then the MCP, PIP, and DIP joints all move back into more flexion to end the movement like the right side.